I wanted to start by getting some backstory, where it began, which was basically when you were a toddler, wasn't it? Sat on your mother's knee or sat in your cot listening to her playing piano.
My mother told me, I don't remember back this far, but she said when I was 2 to 3 years old, we had a piano in the house. Neither one of my parents are pro musicians, but we had a piano and a guitar just for fun. She said I would climb up on her lap on the piano and pick out melodies already at 2 or 3 years old, on the piano. So I began asking for lessons, maybe 5 years old, and about 6 I started classical piano lessons. That was my first instrument, actually. And I picked up violin at 9.
At age 9, you've picked up and chosen an instrument, which is something that brings horror to most parents, because the thought of somebody learning to play a violin. But why weren't you drawn to something like, like guitar or drums, something that was a little bit cooler, maybe?
I did want to play guitar and drums, but in school, we had to choose to be in either band or orchestra in the symphony. And so they had us write on a little note card what our first, second, and third choice instruments were in an orchestra. So my first choice was tenor sax, and then alto sax, and then bari sax, because I wanted to play old school rock and roll. I was really into like 1950s roots of rock and roll music when I was a kid. And I wanted to play saxophone, and they actually said it was too heavy for me to carry to the bus, so I should try the violin instead because it's lighter. That's really why I started playing the violin. But my love of rock music never died, and as I got a little bit older, into my teens, into my later teens, I discovered more and more classic rock music, many bands from Britain, of course, and I wanted to play my violin the way that they played guitar. And so that's kind of how I started doing what I do for a career now.
Fluff anything up or whatever, it'll be edited, etc. So it's not a problem. So I wanted to start by getting some backstory from you, where it began, which was basically when you were a toddler, wasn't it? Sat on your mother's knee or sat in your cot listening to her playing piano.
My mother told me, I don't remember back this far, but she said when I was 2 to 3 years old, we had a piano in the house. Neither one of my parents are pro musicians, but we had a piano and a guitar just for fun. She said I would climb up on her lap on the piano and pick out melodies already at 2 or 3 years old, on the piano. So I began asking for lessons, maybe 5 years old, and about 6 I started classical piano lessons. That was my first instrument, actually. And I picked up violin at 9.
I mean, this is incredible, actually, because yes, you can understand piano and children. I've got a daughter, and so I've been through all of this, the music lessons and making sure they do their practice. But at age 9, you've picked up and chosen an instrument, which is something that brings horror to most parents, because the thought of somebody learning to play a violin and this sound. But why weren't you drawn to something like that were, like guitar or drums, something that was a little bit cooler, maybe?
I did want to play guitar and drums, but in school, we had to choose to be in either band or orchestra in the symphony. And so they had us write on a little note card what our first, second, and third choice instruments were in an orchestra. So my first choice was tenor sax, and then alto sax, and then bari sax, because I wanted to play old school rock and roll. I was really into like 1950s roots of rock and roll music when I was a kid. And I wanted to play saxophone, and they actually said it was too heavy for me to carry to the bus, so I should try the violin instead because it's lighter. That's really why I started playing the violin. But my love of rock music never died, and as I got a little bit older, into my teens, into my later teens, I discovered more and more classic rock music, many bands from Britain, of course, and I wanted to play my violin the way that they played guitar. And so that's kind of how I started doing what I do for a career now.
So was it a musical household, in as much as was there music on all the time when you were growing up? Your parents had big record collections. I mean, you talk about this love of 50s rock and roll. It's not normally what kids are drawn to, especially when you're you're at school and you're talking to all your friends, it's unlikely that they're going to be into Eddie Cochran.
Yes, when I was very young, my dad and his best friend, they were really into the 50s music, and them and my mom and his wife, they would all go to sock hops together. So they played, Elvis and Chuck Berry and everything from that era, the origins of rock and roll. And so I kind of learned that. And then I distinctly remember one summer vacation from school when I was 11 years old. My best friend and I were in my parents' basement just snooping around and playing and doing whatever you do to pass the time on summer vacation. And we found my parents' record collection, and I found the Abbey Road album by the Beatles. And so they still had a record player in the house, and we figured out how to put it on the thing. And I think we probably had the speed wrong at first, and they sound like chipmunks or something. And then we figured it out. And when we finally got it going, I was like, why do I feel like I know every single song on this album, even though I don't know every song on this album? Yeah. And we played that album the entire summer. And then from there, we found every other Beatles album. And then we went into every album from their solo careers after that. And the Beatles were really a phenomenon because this is decades after they were initially popular. But for some reason, this music felt like it was already inside of us. Like we just knew it. Like it was an old friend that we had just discovered again. And I think their music was really special that way. And so it all started for me with discovering that Abbey Road album. Then from there, I got into Led Zeppelin. I got into Pink Floyd. I got into Deep Purple. And, later some of the prog stuff like Frank Zappa and Rush.
Yeah.
And even later than that, discovered Van Halen in enough time to still have learned Eruption. So even though that took a really long time.
So your first electric violin, a lot of people won't even know that an electric violin exists. So what was it that flicked a switch for that then? What were you looking for? Because obviously it was something, you were being drawn somewhere else with electrification of instruments.
So I had purchased a cheap electric violin for a couple $100s on eBay when I was, I'm not sure, maybe 12 or 13 years old, something like that. And it, didn't stay in tune very well. And all of my classical teachers did not want me to play it. It was a 5-string electric violin. And they said, it's going to mess up your classical playing. Your technique is going to go down the drain. Do not play that thing. But I still wanted to play it because I wanted to sound like guitar players on the violin. My dad had a documentary about Woodstock, the original Woodstock. And one day I walked in and he was watching it and I saw Jimi Hendrix do the Star Spangled Banner. And that was my very first inspiration to plug the electric violin into his amplifier and mess with all the settings and try and get feedback and overdrive and all of that type of thing. And I learned the Star Spangled Banner Jimi Hendrix style. And that was probably the first guitar cover that I ever did on electric violin.
You did have a band, didn't you, or a quartet at school, and you used to do, your parents used to drive you around and you would do weddings and all sorts of other things and parties and so on. But what interested me was the choice of your first arrangement of a song, because you picked an Aerosmith song. Now, if I'd said to somebody, yeah, she picked an Aerosmith song, you would go through the names of maybe 20 before you got to the one that you did, which was I Don't Want to Miss a Thing.
That's right. And I think it's because when I was a kid, that song had just come out maybe, or it was really popular. It was in a movie. And
Armageddon.
That's right. And so at the time it was popular. And I think that's why I chose that particular Aerosmith song. It's funny with, excuse me, bronchitis 3 months later still hanging on.
Terrible.
Certain bands have been around for so long and they've had such great repertoire for decades that some of their music and it could be a different era of that music than someone else knows. My husband knows, he grew up with Aerosmith being the classic Aerosmith, and I grew up with like the 90s Aerosmith, and while I was a fan and I bought their albums, I didn't know the early stuff until later, and he knew the early stuff, and we kind of had found the same thing about Peter Gabriel's music. He's a producer, and he just watched a Peter Gabriel show that he did here in Las Vegas, and he's a fan of Peter's solo career, and I knew all of Peter Gabriel's music from his time with Genesis, so there's another example of these artists that span such a wide variety of music and just decades of creating the music that you could be a fan of totally different eras of the same artist and not know the other stuff exists for a while.
You're obviously an outstandingly talented musician, and you were then as well. You know, you were studying for a master's degree in violin. So was there ever a moment that your career was going to be aligned with classical music, i.e. you going to become a member of an orchestra or, you know, symphony orchestras or, you know, just basically aligned to anything but rock music? Were you getting pulled in that direction?
Oh, for sure. The entire time of my training, it's more acceptable now than it was when I was a kid. Like you can go to a school like Berkeley, for example, and you could study electric violin. You could study alternative types of music, but there was a very, very strict divide when I was a kid between learning classical music and learning any other types, to the point where if you even wanted to join a jazz band, you know, the orchestra people would look down on you and be like, we don't want you playing that kind of music. You know, you're going to ruin your technique. You're going to ruin this. You know, you have to just play this kind of music. And so I think everyone early on was kind of grooming me to want to audition to go to a conservatory and to be in an orchestra. And I played in orchestras right through I got my master's degree. I played in orchestras, but I always kind of resisted, and it was never really what I wanted to do. If there had been an opportunity to learn rock violin or improvisation violin, you know, when I was younger, I'm sure I would have wanted to go in that direction. It just wasn't, it's still not a big thing, but it was definitely not a big thing then.
So you've finished with your classical studies. We have the electric string, but the electric strings, the femmes of rock. We've got the disco bell bottoms. You've got the violin femmes. We've got my favorite, actually, which is Jingle Bellas, which is just a fantastic name. Whatever gave you the idea, right, that this would succeed as a business? Because let's be honest, it's got to make money, because if it doesn't make up money, it's a hobby. It's not a career. So what gave you the, you know, belief that this was something that you could translate into a business?
I think it can go back to my time as an undergraduate, where I studied at the University at Buffalo, and I studied arranging with a teacher who was really into kind of eclectic music styles like Frank Zappa and King Crimson and things like that. And so he had a really open mind for different types of music. And it was a really great 4 or 5 year period in my growth as a person, as a musician, culturally, to be involved with the college professors I had at the University at Buffalo. They knew so much about so many things, and I was like a sponge at that time, and I wanted to learn so much. And I actually, within my courses there, I wrote an arrangement of the band Chicago's Ballet for a Girl in Buchanan, and I arranged it for electric strings, horns, and rock band, and that was what I did for my final exam grade in that arranging class, was take for this special instrumentation and arrange that, you know, body of music. And after that, I think my teachers kind of knew that I wasn't going to want to go down the classical road. And he suggested to me that I might want to go west, you know, that there'd be a market for this in places that had a lot of corporate events. And Las Vegas is one of those places where any given day there are, you know, 50 conventions going on the Las Vegas Strip, where companies like MasterCard or Verizon or, you know, whoever will bring their company convention to the Las Vegas Strip, and they have entertainment for these conventions that sometimes last days long. So, you know, and then when things just work out the way the universe does, I got offered a job playing in Wayne Newton's orchestra on the Las Vegas Strip. So I decided, well, I'll move to Las Vegas. I'll take the job. I'll get my master's degree at UNLV while I'm in Las Vegas so that I at least can continue with that. I'll do that for a year or two, and then I'll go to medical school because I wanted to be a doctor. I was studying pre-med in my undergraduate as well. And I said, and, you know, I'll do that a few years. It'll be fun. And then, you know, whatever. But at that point, one good musical thing after another kept happening. And before I knew it, like, there was no medical school and I was just a professional musician. So But it all happened when I moved to Las Vegas. All of the arrangements that I started writing as a kid that we played in the weddings and at the restaurants in the Buffalo area, I expanded on that. I learned to get better at writing arrangements. You know, the longer I studied composition and arranging in school, the better my arrangements became. And pretty soon I had hours of music compiled, and I had met other musicians in Las Vegas playing in the shows. I got sponsored by Yamaha. I was able to get the electric instruments, and we put together a electric string quartet with backing tracks, and we mostly performed private corporate events in Las Vegas. And we got a pretty good reputation with a lot of clients doing that here. And one day, during one of those private events, a guy who owned a theater asked if we could do that in a ticketed show setting, like a production show. He's like, I think this would be great as a show. People would love to see this. And I never really thought about it before, but I said, okay. And so then I wrote the Femmes of Rock show, which is really a production show and not just like a smaller corporate act. We have a live 3-piece band. We sing in the show. We have specialized arrangements and medleys. We have video content that syncs with the show. And that's kind of how the whole thing started. But it can go all the way back to me being 12 or 13 years old and writing string quartet arrangements in Buffalo of I don't want to miss a thing.
And it's not as simple, is it, as you just taking a Pink Floyd, a Rush, a Zeppelin song, a Van Halen song, and just recording it as a complete, just copy it as a cover, because the arrangements are completely different. Obviously the instruments are different, and so you get a different sound. So it's not as if you're just going, right, okay, so today we'll do Whole Lot of Love, right? Let's get going. There's a process behind this. You have to go away and work at it before you actually integrate it into the show, and it works.
Yes, exactly. And when I started performing in rock bands later in my career after I moved to Las Vegas, I was amazed that you could just be like, okay, we're going to learn Van Halen Panama, and then everyone just goes and learns their parts, and then you just go play the song. And I was like, wait, I don't have to write you out charts to do this. And, it was like amazing to me that in the rock world, people just went and learned songs, because my whole life, if I want my string quartet to play Panama, I have to sit down and take everything that's in that song, and I have to be able to condense it into 4 instruments. And if I'm writing it for an acoustic quartet without a band behind us, I have to take into account I need a rhythm, I need bass, I need melodies, I need harmonies. How do I condense all that? Perhaps the hardest one for me was Bohemian Rhapsody. Trying to condense that into an arrangement that worked for an acoustic string quartet was not the easiest thing, choosing which parts to put where. And then when you write an arrangement for a string quartet with a rock band, you don't want to step on the toes and double the stuff that the rock band is doing. So you write it in a totally different style than you would if you were writing without a band behind you. For instance, I don't want to put the cello on the bass line if the bass line is already doing the bass line, because they might be small variations that will make it clash in the arrangement. So I'll use the cello more like a solo instrument when we have a live band behind us. But when we're playing just as a string quartet, I'll use the cello as the bass line. These are all things that I learned, by trial and error over the years of doing this with different sorts of instrumentation.
Do people give you enough credit for this? Or do you find that people just come on and say to you, well, yeah, I mean, it's good, but you're just taking other people's material. So, I mean, how hard can it be? It's just like it's a covers band. So nobody really takes the time to actually understand basically the love that you put into this. It's like that you have this classical mindset that is going to work on rock music.
I think most people don't understand the amount of work that goes into creating a specific and unique arrangement of a song, which is much different than just, let's go learn this song and go play it in a band. And it takes a special skill, the same kind of skill you need to orchestrate, anything, to write for a symphony, which is what I went to school and learned how to do in a lot of the courses I studied. But people will come on my videos and be like, oh, Eddie Van Halen already did this 40 years ago, so, you suck until you can do something on your own. And to me, as a classical musician, it's so shocking, because the best musicians in the world perform with the best symphony orchestras in the world doing centuries-old music, and they still do it. That's the repertoire. Why did I grow up learning Bach and Mozart and Beethoven and Mahler and Paganini and all this stuff? Because it's standard beloved repertoire that makes you better at your instrument. And so, like, nobody goes up to Itzhak Perlman and they're like, you suck because you're a cover band. You're just covering Paganini. Nobody says that, but why should it be any different to cover Eddie Van Halen or to cover Rush? This is standard beloved repertoire that makes you better at your instrument if you learn it. Everybody should learn Eruption. Everyone should learn every solo Eddie Van Halen ever did.
So tell me, you've covered Pink Floyd, Rush, Zeppelin, The Who, I mean, Queen, everybody. What made you sit down there and think one day, I know, I'll do Eruption? What were you doing? I mean, I know you have a great quote about yourself. That you say, nothing motivates you more than somebody who tells you it can't be done. So was that a motivation? Had somebody said to you, you'll never be able to do this?
Well, Eruption came on my radar fairly early, and it's considered like the solo of all solos on guitar. You know, everybody needs to learn that at some point. And I was like, well, it's probably the solo of all solos on violin as well, if anyone's actually done it. And so I had at the time, there's actually a video somewhere on social media where I videoed myself practicing the beginning of Eruption on my 5-string fretless violin. And I quickly found out that if I wanted to complete the cover on a 5-string fretless, I would have to do it in a higher octave. I didn't have the strings to have the same range that Eddie had on the guitar. And I would also not be able to do the finger tapping, which no matter what I did on a fretless instrument, it's not happening, the finger tapping. And so I kind of, for a little while, had to wait for technology to catch up with what I wanted to do. And a few years later, I learned that Wood Violins, this company started by Mark Wood, who's a pretty famous electric violinist, played with Trans-Siberian Orchestra, he invented this kind of violin that you can see that flying V, it straps on. You don't
yeah.
For it. And they make them up to 7 strings, and they make them with the option of putting frets on them. So I ordered one, and it took like a year for them to custom make this instrument. And at the time, I couldn't find anything online at all of any violinist who'd ever done finger tapping on an electric violin. I searched and searched, found nothing. I had no idea if when I got this thing with the frets, it would even work at all. And then sometime after I got the instrument, I found, as I was starting to make it work myself, I found a video of another guy who goes by the name of Bo Breakers on the internet. He's maybe a college student, I think, and he was able to make the sound tapping as well. So I had found like one other person, and still to this day, I think me and him are the only people I've ever seen make the sound on an electric violin. But it sounded horrible. And every time I'd fix one problem, another problem would come up. And it took learning this whole new technique on the instrument to be able to do it as fast. The strings are much smaller, much tighter, and much higher off of the fingerboard. And the frets are super, super tiny on a violin. It's not like where you have this big space like on a guitar. And when you go to do the tapping on a violin, the notes don't speak at all acoustically. Like if you took an electric guitar and did tapping on it, you could still hear the notes somewhat even when the guitar is not plugged in. And so a lot of noise was happening, and I had to really work on specific things within the effect chain. Still, up to 2 days ago, I just bought another new pedal to try and make the sound even better for my live shows, because I always wanted to keep improving. But I think that process took a long time. And in the beginning, my husband, who's also a musician, he can play guitar, and he picked up the violin to just try. He's like, this ain't going to make a sound. Like, it's just not going to happen on this instrument. And,
this took you a year to perfect. One whole year for one song.
To purchase gear. You can't just go to a music store and try gear anymore. They don't have anything in stock. So you have to buy it, wait for it to ship to you. If it doesn't work, you ship it back. You buy another thing. You try it out. You ship it back. This went on for months where I had to just try out different pedals that I purchased and sent back, because you can't just, if I could have just gone to a store and tried the stuff out, it might have eliminated a few months of the time it took to figure this out. But it's the way it is now. And finally, one day my husband was in the shower and I was practicing in the studio here, and he came out and he said, oh, I thought you were playing Van Halen's recording. And it was me practicing the tapping section of Eruption. And that was the day that I knew that I was close. I was like, okay, I think I'm ready to lay this thing down. Let's do it. So that was the day, because he knows all these solos really, really well, being a music producer of shows himself. And for him to have walked out and thought that it was Van Halen, I was like, I'm getting close now. Okay.
Oh, he wasn't the only one. He wasn't the only one. Believe me. You said also that you'd never worked as hard on anything since you basically did that master's degree violin recital. So again, another indication of how much work and dedication went into making this work.
It was a lot, because I could have done it just on a regular violin with a violin type interpretation. But if you've seen the things I do on my page, I really want to try and make the violin sound as close to the original guitarist as I possibly can. And so some of that, it starts with the transcription. So I'll take the solo, I'll transcribe it into notation, and then I'll try and figure out the way to play it that sounds like the original. Where's there going to be a slide? Where's there a string bend? Where do I do this? Where do I have to try and sound like a pick attack? And then, once you figure out that stuff, the actual physical part of playing it, I'm lucky that my husband is also like I said, a producer, and he's also a keyboard player. So he's really great at knowing how to achieve certain sounds, because keyboard players, I think, have a special knack for creating certain sounds like that. So, I'll get it to a certain place. He'll take it and really know like what extras to help with the mastering of the tracks that I'm doing. And then I think between the combination of all of that, I've been able to get the sounds pretty close to the point where people think that I'm just miming to the original recordings on my stuff.
Bleeding fingers and blisters, that was something else. You're putting yourself through an awful lot to actually perfect just what is a 2-minute piece of music. It's an incredible project that you've undertaken, and to maintain the level of interest and not lose interest halfway through and just think, oh, I'll come back to it in a couple of years' time. You are pretty much one of the most driven people.
I almost did, and I had to make a conscious decision not to put out any easier videos, because I went a good span where I didn't post on social media, and social media doesn't like when you do that. Like, they'll stop showing your videos to people if you don't post regular content. And I was like, I'm not learning anything else until I finish Eruption, even though I have, I feel like I want to go learn something easy to just put it out there for content while I'm finishing this. No, I'm not going to do anything until I finish it. And for the last month or two, I kind of locked away and didn't work on anything else but that, and drove my family crazy. They heard it 4 million times in the house. And but
what were you expecting when the day that you put that video up on social media, and was it in line with what actually did happen? Because obviously you're known, as we said, in the States, in North America, Canada, etc., but less so in Europe and the rest of the world. Yet if you look at the comments, this really was a global phenomenon.
Yes, definitely. Tons of people from the UK are now asking when my Femmes of Rock show will be there touring. People from Canada, even people in Asia that I don't even understand the comments because I can't read them. But I mean, it's really catapulted it to another level. I think that in the week following me putting this cover out, I think I gained something like 30,000 new Facebook followers and 20,000 new Instagram followers and 30,000 on TikTok. It was like altogether, probably 250,000 new followers on all of my platforms of social media just in the week following putting out the video. I think I didn't expect it to happen that fast. I think I knew that it would get some traction because it's unique, and I don't think there's a lot of people doing that out there. But I didn't know it would happen so quick.
But because the first thing that happens is, when I saw it and when everybody else saw it, I would imagine you think that it is you miming it. I mean, it sounds exactly the same. There is no difference. None.
Many people accused it of being Eddie's recording. They're like, how dare you just put yourself to Eddie's recording? So what I've done since then, I've posted 2 videos on my page. Of course, they didn't get as much traction as the official video with the outfit and everything. But one of me just doing the tapping section in Soundcheck, and another one, a live performance from a week ago, that I did a duet of Eruption with our guitar player live on stage, where you can hear the crowd, and we stop and we look at each other. So you can obviously tell it's definitely not Eddie's recording, because we did it in our live show. So hopefully by posting that stuff, people will see that I'm not miming to Eddie's recording.
Did you get any reaction from anybody in the Van Halen camp?
Yes, actually, Michael Anthony, bass player from Van
Yes,
Halen,
yeah.
he commented on the video, actually the live version and the studio version that I put out. So it was really cool to get his approval on the whole thing, since he's one of the original guys.
So I suppose the question is, really, after you've done this and it's given you all of this incredible exposure, what do you do next? Because I noticed one of the comments that you made was basically, I wish I'd paid more attention to myself as an individual performer, as opposed to being in the band a few years ago, and concentrated on me. So is that what you're going to do now? Concentrate on you?
Yeah, I think I spent a lot of years pushing the corporate entertainment stuff, which I still have the group Bella Electric Strings and the Jingle Bellas and the Disco Bellas and all the groups that you saw. But I pulled myself out of performing in them a few years back because I didn't have enough time. It was just so many things. So now I manage the group, I book the group, I still write the music for the group, I still own the group, but I have other performers doing the corporate stuff now. And I go out on the public tour dates and I perform those. Otherwise, it was just I would not sleep. It's way too much to have done all of it.
Because you have a family as well. Let's not forget you've got children.
Toddler and an elementary school age boy and a toddler girl. So it's a lot to try and manage. But now that I've started doing this, I'm like, I don't know why I didn't do this a lot sooner, because I have music to write and I have things to do. So I think after Eruption, the next logical step is to put out my own album with some original material as well. I don't think there's anything else I could do that's a cover that's going to top Eruption. So I think I have to start putting out my own repertoire.
So have you had any contact with people that are looking to maybe do something with you to get you involved? I mean, would you like to do something with somebody like, I don't know, Steve Vai or Richie Blackmore or Joe Satriani?
These people are who I grew up idolizing, guitar players, obviously. And if I had the chance to collaborate with or write a song with, or have somebody produce a song with me, all the people that I would love to work with, you know who they are, because they're the ones that I cover on my page. And some of them aren't with us anymore, and some of them are. And if I ever had that opportunity, I think that would be the next logical step for fulfillment in my career. But at the same time, I think that we're capable of putting out a pretty quality product just from my studio here with the kind of things that I've already been doing.
What about solo show with you're basically doing Eruption and, a whole host of all the other stuff you've done, because your husband has collaborated with you on some of them as well and sang. So, again, is there, a chance of a festival appearance or something like that?
Yes, a lot of the solos, including Eruption, we put in the Femmes of Rock show. So you can see me perform some of that stuff in the show that we tour now. But after I get a solo album out, I think at that point, that's when there's going to be a different band and a different show to kind of promote that product.
And you're working away. You're working on this actually now, are you? You're working on original material as we speak?
At this point, I have a ton of stuff sketched out. I have laid down very little of it, and I'm trying to plan out, okay, if I'm going to do a 10-song album, I'll do a few covers, stuff that I've always wanted to do that I've never actually done yet, but then there's going to be a lot of original stuff on there. And I have to plan this around our busy touring season, because one thing that's really hard to do is to try and write or record any music on the road, or when you're only home for 3 days and then you're on the road again. It's not happening when you have kids too. So right now it's looking like we're busy in May and June with a ton of tour dates, but July and August are always slow season for performances for us. We don't have a lot of corporate events because nobody wants to come to Las Vegas in July and August and roast. And our tour dates are always a little bit slower in July and August. So I think that's the time when I'm going to be hitting that stuff the hardest. You know?
Have you enjoyed the media coverage? Have you enjoyed talking to people in different parts of the world? I mean, I see you've done plenty.
Yeah, it's actually fun because everybody has sort of a different audience that their interviews will reach because everybody's from a different place. And I feel like people are at least gaining some more awareness about the instrument that I play because many people will leave a comment and say, "Oh, well, you're playing a miniature chin guitar." I'm like, no, it's not really a guitar at all. And by doing these sort of interviews, I get to kind of explain, no, it's really a violin, like with 4 strings, only you add 3 low strings on the bottom for range, just like you would take a bass and you can have a 5-string bass or a 6-string bass so that you have extra range. And they come in fretted or fretless, the same way a guitar or a bass will. You can get a fretless bass or you can get a fretted bass. A fretless bass doesn't mean that it's a cello just because it's fretless. It's still a bass. You know, it's the same thing with the violin. So I think that by doing these interviews and reaching a larger audience, hopefully there's more awareness about this instrument, and hopefully it can become part of, regular rock bands, because I don't think the violin's ever been considered something in like a hardcore rock band ever. So
no, well, nothing unless it's something like the Trans-Siberian Orchestra. And lastly, your favorite track, the track that you love to play more than any other, is still The Who, Barbara O'Reilly?
I think that, like, if I have to pick one quintessential song of rock music that's the most kick-ass song that exists, I'm like, Bob O'Reilly is right up there. It doesn't get much more kick-ass than that song, and every time I play it, I'm reminded of that. So I still think, yes, that's one that I never get tired of playing.